Hello everyone, I am Jamarl Thomas. I am your host. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, I hope you guys have had a really good day up to this point. I always say up to this point. I wish you guys have had a good day in general. So, before I start, if you guys enjoy what I put down and you find yourself coming back to this channel often, please consider supporting this content either through PayPal or Patreon. It helps a lot. I don't necessarily like to trust YouTube. But I do trust my subscribers. So, that said, take a look behind me. These high-stepping guys. This is Russia. They're celebrating Victory Day. Now, you may say, what is Victory Day? This is in Red Square, Moscow Red Square. What is Victory Day? Victory Day is the day Germany lost the war. May 8th, 1945. And I know we're 2 days off. Let's call it belated Victory Day. I have to be honest, I am blown away by this newspaper. I am a history fanatic in this stuff, and I often wow over stuff that my wife doesn't necessarily get the full significance of. Or she doesn't care about the full significance. Let's say it that way. It's just a difference in what we care about. But the New York Times. The war in Europe is ended. Surrender is unconditional. Now remember, the United States was still at war with Japan. But the moment that the war ended with Germany, the war with Japan couldn't last. Is what it boiled down to. Wild part is, Germany and Germany and Japan weren't even coordinating that much together on the war front. Germany could have attacked Russia. Japan and Germany could have coordinated their attacks on Russia. They didn't do so. But whatever reason, the moment that Germany was out the war, Russia started to help the United States with regards to Japan, in which case Japan didn't stand a chance. The United States dropped a bomb on Japan, something that it didn't necessarily have to do, but that's kind of beyond the point. Victory Day. Why don't we celebrate Victory Day? Like, we don't have to celebrate in those ways. I don't necessarily need a military parade. In fact, I don't want a military parade at all. Parades in San Francisco and New York. Think of what this means. Nazism fell. The world leaders at this point had come together. FDR was willing to work with essentially a tyrant in order to accomplish a grisly goal of putting down Nazism. This wasn't done entirely by the United States in the same way that it's taught here in the United States. If we look at the death totals, the Soviet Union had 25 million deaths estimated. Now that's in a war that lost, I think, up to 85 million people. I mean, give or take, it depends on how many people you're talking about. But when you get to those numbers, even if you say 80 million people, doesn't really matter. Upwards of 85 million people died in this war. 25 million Soviets. The German war machine, that up to this point was considered to be unstoppable, broke its back in the Soviet Union. Hitler needed oil in order to make that war machine run. In this video, there's parts of this video where these guys are using bicycles, and people always say, if they have high-tech machinery, why are they using bicycles? Because for all of German technology, it still needed gas to run. Part of the reason that Hitler broke his pact with Stalin was gas. When that broke his pact, Hitler was always going to betray. They were always going to turn on each other. Stalin made a pact just because the West didn't want to make a pact with Stalin. Again, this gets way beyond the point. Hitler needed gas. Part of his reason for going into Russia was gas. There was no way for that war machine to run without having gasoline. So in many parts in Russia, they started using horse. In some cases, actually saw bicycles. They ran out of gas. But that's it. Up to that point, though, it looked as if Germany was completely unstoppable. They went through one country after the next, this kind of war of motion, subduing them. As you see here, FDR looks extremely weak. Because he is. He's on his way out. He's on his deathbed. Winston Churchill, at one point, stands alone against Germany. Look at the deaths. The United States, 418,000. But the United States armed the world in this case. And this war was the war that converted the United States into a superpower. For good or ill, turned us into a superpower. The United Kingdom, the little island, stood alone in the Battle of Britain, stopping Germany from essentially invading Britain. What's his name? Likes to say that they'd be speaking Germany if it wasn't for the UK, or if Winston Churchill gave in. And the blood-curdling speeches that Winston Churchill gave in this case is amazing. My point is this. Why isn't this a holiday? There is no point of the world that this war didn't touch. These are the deaths by nation. Look at this. China, Germany, Poland, East Indies, France, Latvia, Singapore. There is no corner of the world that this war didn't touch. Why isn't this a holiday? And yeah, I'm being somewhat wistful on this point because I look at this and say, this was an amazing day. Now, I understand that the United States still had an additional war. But when you look at this kind of world celebration for something that ended that was absolutely grisly, looks like this would meet the cake. Rhode Island is the only state that is celebrated, and I think that's celebrated in August. And that's after Japan surrenders. I don't care what day it's on. Actually, I do care what day it's on. And let me explain my point of view here. It would be awesome if this was somewhat of a federal holiday, but I'd even be so lustful as to say a world holiday. We're talking about Nazism going down. Now, I'm completely unbiased on this. Part of my bias here is that we're 2 minutes to midnight. And it's a grasp for any level of world unifying principle. And if there is any world unifying principle, it's at the end of World War II, where there was at the very least some semblance, some knowing that world leaders, when given the opportunity, even if they all agree, even if they're in different political systems, can come together for a common unifying purpose. Today, we have the Democratic Party howling at the height of their lungs that the Trump administration is working with the Russians. That's in spite of an investigation that they wanted, saying to the contrary, still digging that ditch. On the other side, you have the Trump administration, who's given over policy, national security policy, to a maniac, a person responsible for nearly 1 million dead. My assertion is that part of the reason he did that, one part, he's unempathetic, but another part, he wants to be somewhat of a hardline on various places, and Iran was one of the places that even before he got into office, he said he was going to take a hardline on. Supposedly, Trump doesn't necessarily want a war in this situation, but is the intentions of Donald Trump and the attack dog that he's using the same? Are they? Listen to this.
For over 10 years since coming to these events, that the declared policy of the United States of America should be the overthrow of the mullah's regime in Tehran.
Do you know, he's talking about in 2019, he's talking about this year, that he's going to be celebrating in Tehran this year. He gave the speech for the MEK group. The MEK is a terrorist cult, even by the United States standards. Apparently Hillary Clinton took him off the cult list. But Bolton wants to use this cult as the people in the Iran to take power after the people go down. And apparently he made $30,000 to $60,000 off giving the speech. Does Donald Trump's intentions, meaning if Donald Trump doesn't want to get embroiled into a larger war, are the intentions of the attack dog that got the last president embroiled into a larger war the same? Meaning Bolton was instrumental in the Iraq war, the weapons of mass destruction nonsense. He's now come with troika of terror for the southern hemisphere, and is even now still pushing this weapons of mass destruction nonsense. Regardless of what Trump wants, he's put in an attack dog with a penchant for dragging presidents into larger conflicts. They've put out a false intel report, or an intel report, saying that the Iranians are doing something. Something is taking place. And so the United States has moved a warship to that region of the world. That's not not to mention sanctions and all this other stuff that they're putting in order to squeeze that country. Do you know that there's a flood that's taking place in Iran? And apparently 70% of the rainfall that these guys tend to get over the course of a year is taking place in 13 days. The United States hasn't lessened the sanctions one iota. 40,000 people died because of the sanctions in Venezuela, and I would imagine that number is going to be nearly as bad, if not worse, in Iran. Sanctions are an act of war. The president may not realize that, but they are. Listen to the other one.
Your review that has put Russia on notice that we're going to recapitalize our deterrent force in Syria. Now, a handful of weeks ago, the Russians met their match, and a couple hundred Russians were killed. The list of actions that this administration has taken, I'm happy to walk through each of them, but I don't want to take up.
This is Mike Pompeo talking about a bunch of Russians have been killed based on policies that the United States has taken in somebody else's country, to which is there, I would say illegally, they would say with a fig leaf. This is simultaneously why the Democratic Party is screaming that the President of the United States is working in coordination with the Russian government. There's a reason that the nuclear clock is 2 minutes to midnight. Take a listen to this. This is Lawrence Wilkerson. Lawrence Wilkerson worked under, what is his name? I can see him. Colin Powell. Worked under Colin Powell in the Bush administration. Listen to what he's saying about Bolton and Trump. Wilkerson doesn't seem to believe that Trump is fully engaged. Wilkerson's basic argument, and this argument I think I agree with, is that Trump has delegated responsibility to these guys to various sectors. So they promised him that they would be able to take down Maduro without causing a larger conflict. The article in the Washington Post that talks about Trump getting pissed off at Bolton kind of brings that home. It means that Wilkerson is probably right on this case. That Trump got the word that Bolton, or in this case Pompeo, was able to accomplish X or Y, and he gave him the free will to do so, providing they didn't get him embroiled into larger conflicts. Meaning he gave him limits in regards to where they can go. Those limits being, don't get me into a war. But the problem with this is, just because you delegate that responsibility to somebody, and just because you tell them that these are your limits, it doesn't necessarily mean that they won't put you into a situation that will make you come off those limits. For example, we have intelligence that something has been happening in the Gulf of Tonkin. We have intelligence that there's been a chemical weapon strikes. We have intelligence that something has taken place somewhere around the globe that demands the president do X. The same thing that the president didn't necessarily want to do. My point is, and his point is, that Donald Trump may have given these guys a certain degree of agency to go and solve an issue that he's somewhat hands-off on the details. But being hands-off on these details can pull you into a larger conflict. And I made the argument once before that the First World War was only a pretext to the Second World War. And the First World War sparked off by something that seems rather innocuous in some other corner of the globe, because somebody like John Bolton was willing to drag his country into a larger conflict. Let's listen to Wilkerson.
Dealing with each other, and they're dealing with each other on the script I presuppose that Donald Trump has put out there for them. That Trump wants negotiations. He wants to sit down with Rouhani, Zarif, both of them, whatever, and he wants to resume negotiations so he can leap up from the chair and say, look, I got a better deal than President Obama. He wants to do a Kim Jong-un moment with Rouhani and Zarif. He wants to do it really close to the election, too, because it would be a real kick for him electorally. So Bolton is operating, I think, under that script guidance, if you will. But at the same time, John wants more than that. John wants regime change. And so what worries me here, and your talk about the deployment of forces and so forth, and what might be going on with Saudi Arabia and with the UAE and with Israel, really worries me, because Trump's attention to detail is almost non-existent. John Bolton, and with regard to Venezuela, for example, Marco Rubio, Rick Scott from Florida, Elliot Abrams, and a host of people are making mischief. Well, John Bolton and his crew are making mischief with regard to Iran, and that crew might include some of these military forces that are deploying there. If we're looking for an incident, it's not going to be hard to manufacture one. If we're looking for a Tonkin Gulf, if we're looking for a smoking gun in a mushroom cloud, those kinds of propagandistic things, those kinds of made up things that lead to war, then this is a perfect scenario in which to find something like that.
The guy who's screaming about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, do you believe that countries, Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE, all of those countries have an interest in fighting to the last dead American, particularly in regards to the issue of Iran? His point is, look, if they're looking for something in order to get the president to sign off on some kind of war, well, you have a bunch of countries around there that don't necessarily mind giving some reason to do so. And you have somebody like John Bolton, who is perfectly, what's the word I'm looking for? Perfectly able, willing, and immoral enough to try to pull something off to that way. And Donald Trump, not being that most attentive to detail, may get the patsy for doing so. I don't know why Wilkerson is wrong here. Like I said, in my more lustful moments, this notion of Victory Day, at the very least, will be a unifying principle that the world can remember and hold on to. Because in the same way that the First World War, again, was a precursor to the Second, I just think small events sometimes have larger repercussions that are not the easiest to predict. And with the cast of crew that Donald Trump has put in that office, not to mention the military allegiances that have started to create, with Russia working with Venezuela, Russia working with Iran, working with Syria, China. And by the way, it's not Russia working with these countries in the same way, it's not Russia invading these countries. These countries are friends and allies of Russia in this sense. We'll find military blocks. I think this is a dangerous time for these guys to be interacting, especially with the maniacs that are in that office and with the potentials that could come about. We've had one Republican administration that screamed that they were weapons of mass destruction and took this country into a war to which we're still at. There were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. The guy who was in the office when that took place was John Bolton. John Bolton still pushes that nonsense of weapons of mass destruction. So with somebody like Bolton, especially with the U.S. military apparatus and the CIA apparatus, with this notion that he wants to get something popped off to get the president dragged into a quagmire, either in Venezuela and Iran, do I believe that he would do something in order to instigate that? Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And you should be more cynical if you do not. So, I will leave this here, just kind of a heads up of May 8th, defeat of the Nazis. Again, I think this should be a holiday. I also think the defeat of Japan should be a holiday. I don't care what you call it. Don't necessarily need to be having military parades. I do think the world, to some degree, should celebrate the day. And I understand each country have their own things, and I may be overplaying it to some degree. I just look for some kind of world principle that the world can look at in some level of unison and saying, yes, we agree on that point. We agree on that point. The destruction of Nazism. Yes, we agree on that point. And you can make an argument at the point where Japan lost the war. Yeah, we should have a celebration for that day too. But definitely this day, because this day was the most dangerous. This day was the most dangerous. All right, guys, I'll leave this here. If you guys enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support PayPal or Patreon. Thanks all.